I am very pleased and honored to be invited to be part of this discussion. Let me just say that I am the product of public education. All of my education from K through 12 was in the public sector. I did go to, a minor private school back east, but I did get my teacher credentials and my master's degree at the University of California, and but more importantly, I would say that the foundation for my own individual success was laid by what opportunities were available to my father, who also was a product of a public education, and in particular the community college system in California, which during the early '60s was virtually free. I mean, it was in fact envisioned to be free by the creator of the system, or the architect of the system, Clark Kerr, and I remember him working his way through community college and transferring to the California State University, Polytechnic University in Pomona, Cal Poly Pomona, and I remember going to his graduation at age 10, and undoubtedly that laid the basis for a more financially stable platform for me to pursue my own education through the public schools. When I graduated from college, I went to Harvard. I didn't. This was in the early '80s. I didn't have a plan to get to Wall Street. It was not something that was in my brain. But a lot of my classmates found their way there and were making huge sums of money. I couldn't believe the amount of money that they were making, and I kind of felt left out. But I ended up scrounging around for work in the public school system in the Boston area, just by happenstance. And when you're a substitute teacher and you're a young person with a 4-year degree, you're trying to it's like a temp agency. You're signed up with as many of these school districts as possible, and you get a call in the morning, and sometimes you get a long-term assignment. And so I had the experience of going out to the Brookline School District on some days and seeing most of the faculty of the high school there, the Brookline High, with people holding advanced degrees and even PhDs. It wasn't unusual for somebody with a PhD to be teaching classes there, and often they were on textbook writing. If you looked up the major textbook, and you opened up a textbook, whether it was Prentice Hall or whoever was the publisher, you would see that some of these teachers were actually some of the contributors to the textbook writing. And then other days I would travel on the T into inner city Boston, where for the first time in my whole life did I experience walking through a metal detector in an education setting. And to see that the Boston public schools at the time had been hollowed out, that I was called in quite frequently sometimes because the teacher morale was very low. And as a substitute teacher, I could kind of tell who had a lot of structure in place. And in Brookline, it was very easy to kind of assume the substitute role. But in Boston, you could feel the neglect, the disorder, the chaos as you walked in the classrooms, and I saw firsthand the inequity of our public schools. As a young person who had always thought about going into politics, public education was not what I thought of as my career. I thought I was going to go and become a lawyer. I thought it was other pathways that I thought, but public education is not thought of as a. And so I think it is noteworthy you bring it up in my biography that I was a public school teacher for 23 years, and it wasn't through early intention. But this is the 80s. That was 20, 15, 16 years after the first ESEA was passed in the context of civil rights, right? So you had the Civil Rights Bill. You had people forget that immigration was also a civil rights bill, right? It does away with these terrible quotas that were imposed and on non-white immigrants. But you also had ESEA was part of that same spirit of trying to address inequality. And the federal, the states largely are the repositories of funding. Most of, and even still, federal funding comprises about 10% of what the state, of what any given state will spend. 10% of that budget will come from the federal government. The other 90% is from usually local and state sources. And so the federal role was originally envisioned to be the equalizer. It looked at how to target taxpayer resources toward students who have grown up in communities that are faced with inherent unequal access to educational opportunity. So I want to blend these two stories together because as a young man, I'm thinking about the challenges that our country faced or was facing. This was the 80s, so you saw reports like about America's high schools, and there was a commission, I think it was a Reagan commission. Looking back, they were kind of looking for ways to discredit, I think, public schools in large measure. But I was engaged with this issue because I thought that a lot of our country's ills, a lot of our country's shortcomings, a lot of our country's stresses, and the ways in which it wasn't living up to its potential was rooted in the lack of equal opportunity for education. That if we could get education right, if we could get our public schools to work better, that this would address a lot of issues that are related to race relations, to gender, to poverty. That education, our public education was a place to address these things, and I found, from this experience of being a substitute teacher, going from a very wealthy, well-run school district in Brookline and going into the inner city Boston schools and seeing that disparity, I felt it even more deeply. And I said, I don't think I want to go to law school right away. I won't learn how to fix schools by being in a law school classroom, although perhaps I could have gained some tools. So I don't want to disparage anybody who's chosen the law as their career. I have a lot of respect for my colleagues that are lawyers. But I have to say, during my first campaign, my first successful campaign for Congress, when they saw Mark Takano, teacher for Congress, there was always a kind of nodding head, like, yeah, that's a great idea. Send a teacher to Congress, and because the way in which the public esteems teachers, especially public school teachers, even amid the ways in which I think the profession has been disparaged by some of the right wing in our country. There's still a feeling that teachers become teachers, especially public school teachers, for very noble reasons, and I think that's still true today. So let me get to what we're facing right now. I mean, this Congress has passed in its appropriations bills. We're funding Title I funding, when Title I is like the kind of core tool of ESEA, the original ESEA, to address low-income schools. When I eventually chose to become a teacher and became a teacher in California in a community that was near where I grew up, I've worked in Title I schools all my career, and so I'm aware of what the bill that the intention of the original ESEA was for. But we funded Title I at $16.85 billion. This was a historic increase of $1 billion, and the largest increase over a decade. And this showed, this new congressional majority, the Democratic majority's intent to fund public education at a far greater degree, and to specifically direct dollars to those who needed it most. Um, you know, during his address to Congress, President Lyndon Johnson had a clear message and a goal for Congress, which was to declare a national goal of full educational opportunity. And that's, and ESA, of course, stands for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now, when I got to Congress, I chose, I made it clear to the leadership that I wanted to serve on the Education and Labor Committee. That was where my heart lay. I wanted to address what I thought were the problems with high stakes test driven accountability, and the ways in which education dollars are being used to I think unfairly put too much of the onus and burden on teachers. But let me say that there was a previous congressional run I had in '92, and it's interesting. A book I was reading then about from Alice Rivlin was a strategy that she was laying out for President Clinton at the time of how do we increase funding to our public schools, and she proposed a national sales tax. But she said that she argued that we needed to increase both K-12 and public higher education funding, but we needed to find a mechanism by which the states would guarantee a floor, that they wouldn't be encouraged to supplant their own funding with this federal dollars, meaning that they wouldn't take the federal dollars coming in and find ways to actually not increase funding for who it was targeted for, be able to reduce their own fiscal responsibilities. So, in other words, it requires some sort of local maintenance of effort to continue their funding. And what she noted was this phenomenon of states always competing with each other in a negative spiral by giving tax breaks to businesses and corporations to come into, and communities will do the same thing, because communities are often, it differs from state to state, but communities often have the local property tax base, which forms a large part of the school budget. So it's a combination of local funding and state funding the local communities will do the same thing. So there's this evisceration of local and state funding. Everybody's in this race to the race to the bottom as far as education dollars go. So she said, we need a way to counteract this. Well, and that's kind of the struggle that we have with the reincarnated version of ESEA, which is ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act, which was something that I worked on. And I was happy that we sort of toned down a lot of the high stakes test-driven accountability. But, it's always difficult to find that right balance between being overly prescriptive of how you're going to spend that money and to leave discretion, because principals of schools, chafe all the time. Even in a low-income school, I can't spend the money because of the federal restrictions or whatever the strings come with it. But so Congress has to sort of write the law. We write in several portions of ESSA, supplement, add to what you're spending. Don't replace what you're spending, because we intend not for you to replace your dollars and decrease the need for you to fund your schools. We want you to continue to spend what you are spending. Use federal dollars to reduce the inequities, reduce the inequality, but what we need, though, is a good faith partner who is head of the Department of Education to see that the spirit of the law is being undertaken. Needless to say, we have a Secretary of Education who is very clear from the outset was chosen because she doesn't believe fundamentally in public education. She's indicated a preference for, private education. She's been skeptical of the effectiveness of public education, and I think it's just prima facie evidence is in, what the Education Department recommended for the budget. Earlier this year, the Education Department submitted a budget that slashed $7 billion in funding from the Department of Education. They recommended level funding of $15.9 billion for Title I grants, whereas we in the Democratic majority in the House increased it by $1 billion. Meanwhile, they proposed giving new program money of over $50 billion over 10 years to private schools. So keeping Title I funding flat while also increasing private school funding over 10 years is not, to me, a huge endorsement or a statement of support by the Secretary for public education. And more than that, the rulemaking process, because of the flexible way in which we wrote the law open to interpretation, they've used the rulemaking process to really make it hard for the federal government to hold states accountable for not doing the supplanting and for doing the supplementing. And so I think, my fellow panelists will probably get more into the details of what that means. But let me finish there, and I think I hopefully have done my job of giving the background to what's at stake here.
If you have a question, please write them on index cards. Does anyone on our panel like to pose a question to Congressman Takano? Bruce?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
I'm happy to.
Sure.
Kick us off. Congressman, thank you so much for your leadership on this. It's so important. What, in your ideal world, if you were the Secretary of Education, not that would be your ideal job, you have a pretty great job now, what would you like to see the department doing, not the details, but the high level,
The broad
level?
strokes.
What would you hope they would be sending? What message would you hope they would be sending to state leaders about how they should be sort of making sure that their districts are, in fact, using Title I dollars to supplement and not supplant? Like this balance between prescription and flexibility is hard. How, high level, do you have thoughts about sort of how you would start to think about that? It's a hard question, I know, but.
Yeah, it's not been in the nitty-gritty in my own state of California.
Don't expect that at all.
I do know that so an example of harm is what we did with No Child Left Behind.
Mm-hmm.
It was well intended, and everybody, it was actually very progressive liberals joining with conservatives to do this accountability program. And that was very prescriptive, and they used federal dollars. That 10% is pretty good leverage. Say we're not going to let you spend. We're not going to give you this money unless you do this test, and that I was not a. Secretary Duncan and I had some sparring going on in committee. That I didn't think was appropriate, and understand that No Child Left Behind was coming from a place of equity. People were concerned that we're seeing persistent non-achievement in these underrepresented groups. And so civil rights organizations were also sort of vested in that conversation. But I think there was an example of not well thought out over prescription, right? But then on the other extreme, you have the block grant mentality of this, just give the states a chunk of money. But what tends to happen there is that any given state will say, okay, I've got $2 billion. That means I can give a $2 billion tax break. If you're a conservative ideologue at the state or local level, this is just another way. Federal government's giving me a gift, and you don't spend that money to increase education. I think the broad outlines of a policy of what we needed. I still think I go back. It was unfair. It was very elegantly written. by Alice Rivlin, who just passed away a year ago, was how do we come up with a strategy to encourage states not to decrease that we reward the states who increase their spending per pupil. Encourage states to have a floor, right? By the way, I think college affordability is also in the mix here because it's just broadly speaking, we've seen states reduce their share of the public subsidy to higher ed. Look, we talk about the public option in medicine, in healthcare. We have a public option in education. Every state has a public higher ed system. But every state virtually has been, over since the 1960s, when my father was going to Cal Poly Pomona, been reducing the share. My father could go to Cal Poly Pomona while working part-time on a well, then it was not called the UFCW, but he was a member of the Retail Clerks Union. He worked part-time. My mother worked full-time as a school secretary, and they were able to raise 4 boys in the 1960s and part of the early 70s. He could get his education, and there was not this huge debt overhang. Why? Because the University of California and the Cal State system were supported much greater by Californians. I myself, even in the 80s, was able to get a teaching credential, and I could pay for it by the part-time work I was living at home, even after I didn't have a full-time job, but I didn't have a huge debt overhang because of that. And you hear stories about people who became lawyers and doctors in the 60s and 70s. They got a tremendous bargain. Why? Because public higher education, even the professional schools, were supported to a greater degree. I think if I were a leader, a secretary of education, I would try to devise policies to restore both the K-12 sense and the higher ed sense that both levels of education. We got to restore. We got to build that public will to fund these segments, because I think it's the heart of what the American dream is about. What is the American dream about? Social mobility, social and economic mobility. I'm very proud that my own University of California, Riverside, just has been recognized through this index of the students, measuring institutional effectiveness by how socially, economically mobile are they after they go through the school.
So one brief question from here, and then we'll let you leave, Congressman. Would it be a useful way to think about this, that the federal government kind of accountability for the money that it sends to states and districts should be more about where the money is spent, that it actually gets to schools with poor children, and less about the policies? So rather than prescribing a set of policies that states and local districts should pursue, what might be more important is that they're actually spending it on poor kids and on schools that have large concentrations of poverty.
So, question. Well, I think there's a lot of people far more expert than I on how we can look at accountability. I mean, it needs to be broader. It certainly needs to be broader and not so narrowly focused on student test scores. I think we need to find approaches to how we see that money spent, and how, I mean, there does need to be an accountability tied to it. But I think we need to recognize the complexity that low-income schools face, the problem of attracting a stable workforce, having teachers in that workforce, and that's not going to be a matter of just trying to attract Ivy League graduates to work for a couple of years. I mean, that's what I thought I was going to do. I thought I was going to just be, just 2 or 3 years in, and then I was going to go on to professional school. I think that's one model that's out there. I don't think that necessarily is effective. I do think that education dollars can't be sort of spent in isolation. That there's, I have a lot of Title I schools actually in my district now. So I used to teach outside of my district, but one school has 1,000 foster youth in it, right? The education dollars aren't necessarily sort of factoring in what it means for that school district to do 1,000 foster youth, that transition of the foster youth into either a community college. My community college is now thinking of building. So community colleges in California don't typically have residences. They're thinking that they now need to have residences to support these even emancipated youth at age 16. What I'm trying to say is that that education dollars, we have a homelessness issue also with young people, right? People, in how to measure that homelessness, right, is also a difficulty. So there's an array of stressors now that affect education. And I think the AFT and NEA, they've all kind of recognized that poverty, and that's why poverty is a much broader issue in that it can't be addressed only with education dollars.
Well, we thank you very much
Thank you.
for spending your lunchtime with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And now